The cold wind cut through the streets of the city like a sharp blade. It was the middle of December, and snowflakes fell from the dark sky, covering everything in sight with a soft white blanket. The streets were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that only a heavy snowfall could bring. The streetlights flickered, casting soft pools of yellow light onto the snowy pavement. In the distance, the sound of a car engine could be heard, and the occasional footsteps of people trying to keep warm as they hurried home. Michael had just finished his shift at the hospital and was on his way to the parking lot when the call came in. His phone rang loudly in the silence of the ambulance. He picked it up without hesitation, his voice calm and steady as he listened to the dispatcher's instructions. Accident on 5th Avenue, near the old bakery. A woman has been hit by a car. Report of injuries, possible unconsciousness. You're the closest unit, please respond immediately. Without wasting a second, Michael grabbed his keys and hurried out of the ambulance garage. He could already feel the cold air biting at his face as he stepped outside. It had been a long day, and the thought of heading home to a warm bed seemed like the most appealing thing in the world. But as a paramedic, he knew there was no such thing as a typical day. Every call was unpredictable, and this one was no different. The streets, covered in fresh snow, made the drive slow and difficult. The wind was picking up and visibility was poor. Michael kept his eyes on the road as the ambulance swerved slightly, avoiding ice patches. He glanced at his partner, Sarah, who sat quietly next to him, her face serious and focused. They had worked together for years and had seen their fair share of difficult cases, but no two were ever the same. He could tell that she too was bracing herself for whatever lay ahead. As they approached 5th Avenue, they saw flashing lights ahead. The scene was chaotic. A small crowd had gathered near the accident site and emergency vehicles were parked along the street. A police officer waved them in and Michael immediately pulled over, his mind already running through the checklist of things to do. "Let's move fast," he said, his voice tight. Sarah nodded, grabbing the medical equipment they needed as they both rushed to the scene. The woman was lying on the ground, motionless. Her legs were twisted in an unnatural position and she appeared to be unconscious. Michael knelt down beside her, checking for a pulse. It was weak but there. Her face was pale, and there was a faint trace of blood on her forehead. Her clothes were tattered, and she was shivering despite the blanket covering her. Michael quickly assessed the situation. The woman had been hit hard and it was clear she had suffered some serious injuries. But there was something about her that struck him as oddly familiar. He couldn't put his finger on it, but her features, her delicate face felt like something he had seen before. A strange feeling stirred inside him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't the time to dwell on strange feelings. The priority was getting her to the hospital. "Sarah, we need to stabilize her," Michael instructed. He could feel the cold creeping through his gloves as he adjusted the woman's position carefully. She was shivering uncontrollably, and he knew they needed to act fast. He covered her with an emergency blanket, wrapping it around her to help preserve her body heat. "You'll freeze out here if we don't get you to the hospital soon," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him. His words felt more like a promise, a reassurance that she wasn't alone in the cold, despite the uncertainty of her situation. Michael looked up for a moment, glancing at the gathered crowd. A few onlookers were standing nearby, watching in silence. Some seemed nervous, others simply concerned, but all of them stood at a distance, not sure what to do. The chill of the winter air seemed to have frozen them in place. There was no one who could help her now but him. "All right, let's get her into the ambulance," Michael said, trying to keep his tone calm and steady. "We've got to move quickly." With Sarah's help, Michael gently lifted the woman onto a stretcher. They carried her to the waiting ambulance, their footsteps crunching in the snow behind them. The cold air seemed to press in from all sides, but they didn't stop. Time was ticking and every second mattered. Once inside the ambulance, Michael quickly got to work. He started an IV and checked her vitals again. Her pulse was still weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was cold to the touch. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about her, something that was familiar. Her auburn hair, the shape of her face, even the way her eyelids fluttered as if she were about to wake up. It all seemed like a distant memory, but he couldn't place it. Maybe it was just the shock of the situation, the adrenaline making him see things that weren't there. He shook his head, focusing on the task at hand. The ambulance sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic, the siren blaring. Sarah worked beside him, her hands moving quickly and efficiently, keeping the woman stable as they raced toward the hospital. "Hold on. We're almost there," Michael muttered under his breath, as if saying the words out loud would somehow help the woman hold on. Her face, pale and bloodied, seemed to grow more and more familiar the longer he looked at it. His mind was working overtime, trying to place her, but the mystery only grew more frustrating. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the ambulance arrived at the hospital. Michael and Sarah rushed the woman into the emergency room, where doctors and nurses were already waiting. The woman's condition was critical, but she was alive. For now, that was all that mattered. Michael stood back, watching as the medical team worked quickly, but his thoughts were far from the hospital. His mind kept drifting back to the accident scene, to the feeling of familiarity he couldn't shake. Who was she? Why did he feel like he knew her? He sighed, knowing that he wouldn't have an answer tonight. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be the last time he saw her. And when she woke up, he would find out who she was. It was a promise he made to himself, even if he didn't fully understand why. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor as Michael made his way to the emergency room. His mind raced with the details of the accident. The woman's face, pale and lifeless, stayed in his thoughts. He had done his best to stabilize her during the ride to the hospital, but now, all he could do was wait and trust the medical team to take over. The emergency room was busy as always. Nurses moved quickly. Doctors barked orders and machines beeped in a steady rhythm. Michael had been a paramedic for nearly 10 years, and he had seen countless cases like this. But something about this one felt different. Something about the woman, the way she looked, the way she felt so familiar, made his stomach churn with unease. He leaned against the wall outside the trauma bay, running a hand through his hair, trying to shake the feeling of uncertainty. "I've been doing this for too long," he muttered to himself. "It's just another accident. She'll be fine." Sarah, his partner, stood beside him, watching the doctors as they worked. She too was quiet. After all these years of working together, they didn't need to say much to understand each other. She could tell Michael was unsettled. "She's in good hands," Sarah said softly. "Don't worry. We did what we could. She's alive, that's what matters." Michael nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this. He'd seen hundreds of accidents over the years, but this one, this woman, she didn't feel like just another case. The minutes seemed to stretch on as they waited outside, the urgency in the air only growing stronger. Michael's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was the hospital's receptionist, informing him that the woman had been taken in for a CT scan to check for head injuries and internal bleeding. Michael thanked her quickly and hung up. "We'll know more soon," he said to Sarah, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. As they stood there, the door to the trauma bay opened, and a nurse emerged. "She's stable for now, but she has a serious head injury. We're still monitoring her, but the doctor thinks she might be unconscious for a while." "Is she going to be okay?" Michael asked before he could stop himself. The nurse glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It's too soon to tell. She's tough, though. She's got a good chance." The nurse didn't stay long, and Michael and Sarah exchanged looks. Neither of them was satisfied with that answer. They both knew that the next few hours would be critical for the woman's survival. They would need to be patient, but the uncertainty gnawed at them both. As they waited, Michael couldn't stop thinking about how the woman's face had seemed so familiar. He tried to focus on the facts, the injury, the treatment, the hospital routine, but it was no use. The image of her still lingered in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder who she was. Where had he seen her before? He had grown used to seeing strangers in emergency situations, but this woman was different. Just as he was about to give up on figuring it out, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, Michael." He turned to see a familiar face, Dr. Carter, the head of the ER team. Carter was in his mid-40s with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind. Michael had worked with him on many cases before, and he trusted him completely. "How is she?" Michael asked, stepping toward him. "She's holding on," Dr. Carter said. "She has some broken ribs and there's a head injury that we're keeping an eye on. But we're hopeful. The real question is who she is." "Do you know her?" Michael blinked in surprise. "No, I don't think so," he said, though the doubt was still in his voice. "But I swear I've seen her before. Her face, it's so familiar. I just can't place it." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "That's strange. We've been trying to figure out who she is, but no ID, no phone, nothing. She's probably from out of town, but there's something about her that's throwing us off. Michael felt a jolt of unease run through him. What do you mean by that? Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment before responding. Well, I don't want to alarm you, but I've seen her face before too. Not recently, of course. It was years ago, but it's definitely her. I'm certain of it. Just can't remember where. Michael's mind raced. Was it possible that they both knew this woman somehow? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. It was all too strange. This wasn't just a random accident. Can you tell me more? Michael asked, his voice quieter now. What are you thinking? Dr. Carter sighed and rubbed his forehead. I'm not sure, but I'll tell you this, there's something more to this. I think we're going to find out that we know her from somewhere. We just need to be patient. With that, Dr. Carter gave Michael a quick nod and disappeared back into the trauma room. Michael stood there, feeling a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Who was she? Why did they both feel like they knew her? The answers weren't clear yet, but he was determined to find them. Hours passed, and Michael finally decided to head back to his ambulance. He needed some fresh air, something to clear his mind. As he stepped outside, the cold winter air hit him like a slap in the face, but it was a relief. The snow was still falling, and the streets were just as quiet as they had been earlier. He pulled his coat tighter around him and stared up at the dark sky, lost in thought. It wasn't like him to be so consumed by a case, but this woman, there was something about her that wouldn't let go. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. It was a text message from the hospital. They had found an ID in the woman's bag. Her name was Sarah Harper. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Sarah Harper. The name echoed in his mind. And just like that, it hit him, Sarah. It couldn't be the same person, could it? The years had passed, but the name struck him like a memory he hadn't expected to resurface. Sarah Harper. His high school sweetheart. The girl he had lost touch with after they had gone their separate ways. Could this be the same Sarah? Without thinking, Michael turned and rushed back into the hospital, his heart racing. This was no longer just a medical case. It was personal. As he entered the ER again, the weight of the moment hung heavy. He had to know for sure. He had to find out if this woman, this Sarah, was truly the same girl from his past. Michael paced back and forth in the hospital hallway, his mind racing. The name Sarah Harper had hit him like a ton of bricks. It was impossible to ignore the connection. Sarah Harper, the girl he had once loved, the one who had disappeared from his life years ago without any explanation. He paused, running a hand through his hair. Could it really be her? Was this the same woman who had left without a word, leaving him with nothing but memories? He hadn't thought about her in years, but now her name was right in front of him. The mystery was too strong to ignore. He had to know the truth. His thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Carter approached him again, this time with a serious expression on his face. "You're looking like you've seen a ghost," Dr. Carter said with a small smile, though his eyes were full of concern. "Everything okay?" Michael took a deep breath. "I think I know who she is," he said, his voice low. "Her name is Sarah Harper. I used to know her, back in high school." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Sarah Harper, huh? That's interesting." "Yeah," Michael said, trying to stay calm. "She was the one who... Well, we were close once. I haven't seen her in years, but now I'm starting to think it's her. I have to know for sure." Dr. Carter placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Look, I understand how you feel, but let's not jump to conclusions. We still don't know if it's the same Sarah. People change and it's been a long time." "I know," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can't shake the feeling. I have to find out if it's really her." With that, Michael walked quickly down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the nurse's station and asked if he could see Sarah Harper. The nurse, who had been working nonstop, looked up from her computer and nodded. "She's still unconscious," the nurse said, glancing at the chart, "but we're monitoring her closely. If you want, I can let you in for a brief visit, but it'll have to be quick." Michael nodded eagerly. "Please, I just need to see her. I have to know if it's really her." The nurse hesitated for a moment, but then she motioned for him to follow. Michael's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he walked with purpose, his mind filled with questions. What if it was really her? What if he had finally found her again after all these years? They reached the room where Sarah was being treated. Michael paused at the door, his heart in his throat. The woman in the bed was still unconscious, her body hooked up to various machines that beeped softly in the background. She looked so fragile, her face pale and bruised from the impact of the accident. The sight of her made Michael's heart ache. He had never expected to see her like this, lying helpless in a hospital bed. There were so many things he wished he could say to her, so many questions he needed answered. But first he needed to be sure. Was this truly Sarah? He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving her face. He stood there for a long moment, his mind searching for any sign, any detail that could confirm his suspicions. He studied her features carefully, the shape of her lips, the curve of her jawline, the color of her hair, which was now tangled and messy. As he watched her, memories of their time together flooded his mind. He remembered the laughter they shared, the long walks in the park, the way she had smiled at him when they first met. He remembered the way she used to look at him with those soft brown eyes, full of hope and dreams for the future. But everything had changed when she disappeared without a trace. Michael's thoughts were interrupted when the woman's eyelids fluttered slightly, and she let out a soft sigh. His heart skipped a beat as he leaned forward, hoping that she might wake up. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, her eyes began to open, and she looked around the room, clearly disoriented. Her gaze settled on Michael, and her expression seemed to shift from confusion to something more familiar. She blinked, trying to focus, her brow furrowing as if she was trying to place him. "Michael," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. His heart raced at the sound of her voice, and the world seemed to stop for a moment. It was her. "This was Sarah." "Sarah?" he replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's really you." She blinked again, then looked at him more closely. "You're the paramedic, aren't you? You were the one who helped me." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I was there. You've been in an accident. But you're going to be okay." She stared at him for a few moments, then her eyes seemed to soften. I remember you," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I remember." Thus Michael felt a lump form in his throat. He had no idea how to respond. After all these years, hearing her say that was almost too much to bear. It felt like a dream, but at the same time it was real. She was right here in front of him, alive and awake. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said quietly, his voice shaky. "I didn't know what happened to you. You just disappeared. One day you were there, and the next you were gone." Sarah's eyes lowered for a moment, as if she was trying to gather her thoughts. I'm sorry, Michael," she said softly. "I never meant to hurt you. I needed to leave. There were things I had to figure out, and I couldn't stay. But I never forgot you. I think about you all the time." Michael swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. After all these years, he had never really gotten closure. He had never understood why she had left so suddenly. But now, hearing her words, a part of him understood. There was pain in her voice, pain that mirrored his own. He reached out and took her hand gently. "It's okay," he said quietly, though his heart ached. "I don't know what happened, but I'm just glad you're here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Sarah squeezed his hand weakly, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. "Thank you for finding me. I don't know what I would have done without you." Michael smiled softly, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "I'll always find you, Sarah, no matter what." And for the first time in years, Michael felt that old connection rekindle between them, like a spark catching fire after being buried for far too long. They both knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with questions and emotions they had never fully dealt with. But in that moment, they also knew one thing for sure. They had found each other again. The days that followed Sarah's awakening were filled with a mix of relief and confusion. Michael spent every moment he could at the hospital, never leaving Sarah's side for too long. As she regained her strength, the memories of the past began to surface, and with them, a flood of emotions neither of them had expected. Sarah's condition slowly improved, but the accident had left her body bruised and broken. She still couldn't remember much about the moments before the crash. But Michael was with her every step of the way, offering whatever comfort he could. They had talked endlessly, about the old days, about what had happened between them, and about the years that had passed since she disappeared. For Sarah, waking up had been overwhelming. At first, she had no idea where she was or how she had ended up there. But when she saw Michael, everything fell into place. Her memories, once scattered and foggy, began to come together piece by piece. She remembered him, their time together in high school, their walks in the park, the laughter they shared. And then she remembered how she had left without saying goodbye, how she had simply walked away from everything they had built together. But there were things she hadn't told him, things she wasn't sure how to explain. The truth was, Sarah had carried a lot of guilt with her over the years. She had left without giving Michael any answers, without telling him why. She had thought it would be easier for both of them, but in reality it had only made things harder. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow across the hospital room, Sarah looked at Michael with a serious expression. She had been thinking about it all day, the questions she had avoided, the secrets she had kept. It was time to finally open up, to tell him the truth. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady. She had never been good at hiding her feelings, and her vulnerability now was more than she could bear. "The real reason I left wasn't because I didn't love you. It wasn't that at all." Michael sat up straighter in his chair, his heart suddenly racing. He had been waiting for this moment, though he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. I couldn't stay," Sarah continued, her eyes avoiding his. "There were things happening in my life that I didn't know how to handle. I was scared, and I thought I could figure it all out on my own. I didn't want to drag you into it. I didn't want to hurt you." Michael listened quietly, his gaze fixed on her. He had so many questions, but he wasn't sure how to ask them. He had waited for years to understand why she had left without a word. But now that she was here speaking about it, he realized that no amount of explanation could undo the hurt they had both felt. "I had to leave town," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "There were problems at home, things I didn't know how to fix. I thought if I ran away, everything would be different. But it wasn't. It only made things worse. And the whole time I kept thinking about you. I didn't know if I'd ever see you again, and I didn't know if I could ever explain." Michael's chest tightened as he listened to her words. It hurt to hear that she had been suffering in silence all these years. But at the same time, it made him realize something he hadn't fully understood before. She hadn't left because she didn't care. She had left because she was trying to protect him, even if it meant breaking his heart in the process. "I don't know what to say, Sarah," Michael replied softly. "I had no idea you were going through all of that. I didn't understand why you just disappeared. It hurt more than you can imagine, but I can't help but wonder, why didn't you come back sooner? Why didn't you at least let me know you were okay?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I was scared, Michael. I didn't know how to come back. I didn't know if you'd even want to see me after everything that happened. So I kept running, kept pushing everyone away." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation hung in the air between them. Michael could feel the years of hurt and confusion melting away, replaced by a deep sadness that seemed to settle into his chest. But even in the sadness, he realized that Sarah was finally being honest with him, and that meant everything. "Sarah, I don't know what the future holds," Michael said after a pause, "but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're alive, and I'm glad you're telling me this now." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at him. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I never meant to hurt you. You were always so good to me, and I didn't know how to face you again." "I know you didn't," Michael said gently, squeezing her hand. "But we're here now. That's what matters." As the night settled in and the hospital grew quieter, Michael and Sarah sat together talking quietly. They spoke about their past, their memories, and what had happened to them during the years they had spent apart. Slowly but surely they began to rebuild the connection they had once shared. But even as they talked, Michael couldn't shake the nagging question that lingered in the back of his mind. How had she ended up in that accident? Why had she been in that part of the city, in the middle of winter when she was supposed to be living a different life far away from here? As the days passed, Sarah continued to recover, and Michael stayed by her side. They were both learning to navigate the uncertainty of their situation. But they knew one thing for sure. The past could not be undone, but they could still find a way to move forward. One afternoon, after a visit from the doctor, Sarah asked Michael something that had been on her mind since the accident. Do you think there's a reason we crossed paths again? That I ended up here like this?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Michael looked at her, his heart full of emotions he hadn't fully processed yet. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But maybe it's not about the reasons. Maybe it's just about the fact that we found each other again, and now we have a chance to make things right." Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and fear. "I hope we do," she whispered. "I really hope we do." The days after their long conversation were filled with a sense of quiet hope, but also an underlying uncertainty. Michael couldn't deny the deep connection he still felt with Sarah, despite the years that had passed. She had been a huge part of his life once, and now, after everything that had happened, they were here, together again. But it wasn't easy. There was still so much to navigate, so much to understand. Sarah had spent more time recovering in the hospital, and while the physical wounds were healing, her emotional ones were still raw. The truth she had shared with Michael about why she had disappeared weighed heavily on both of them. They couldn't change the past, but they had a chance to rebuild what they had lost. Michael was there every day, sitting beside her, talking when they needed to talk and sitting in comfortable silence when words weren't enough. He knew that rebuilding a relationship after so much time apart wouldn't be quick, but he was willing to try. After all, life had brought them back together for a reason. As Sarah slowly regained her strength, she started to open up more, not just about her past, but about the future too. She had been running away from so many things for years, but now, for the first time in a long time, she was starting to face them head-on. Michael could see the change in her, the way she was allowing herself to feel again, to hope again. One afternoon, about a week after their big conversation, Sarah was sitting up in her hospital bed, looking out the window at the snow falling softly outside. Michael had just finished talking with the doctor, who had given Sarah a positive update on her recovery. He walked into her room, a smile on his face as he leaned against the doorframe. "Good news," he said. "The doctor says you'll be able to leave soon. You've made amazing progress." Sarah smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "It feels strange," she admitted, her voice soft. "I don't know what comes next. I've been away from everything for so long." Michael crossed the room and sat down next to her, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to figure it all out right away," he said gently. "Take it one step at a time. We can figure things out together." For a moment Sarah didn't speak, just looking down at their joined hands. She squeezed his fingers softly. "I know, but sometimes it's hard to imagine what the future looks like when you've spent so much time running from it." Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He'd been running too, in his own way, burying his feelings, pretending that moving on was easier than facing the truth. Now they both had to confront the past in order to move forward. "Maybe the future doesn't have to be perfect," Michael said. "Maybe it just needs to be real. And right now us being here together is real. That's a good place to start." Sarah met his eyes, and for the first time in days she let herself truly believe him. There was still a lot to work through, still a lot of questions left unanswered. But one thing was clear. They had each other. And that was a start. Later that evening, after Sarah had rested, Michael sat beside her, reflecting on everything that had happened since the accident. He had never expected a simple trip to the hospital to change his life so drastically. But here he was, sitting beside Sarah again, facing the complicated emotions of the past while trying to figure out how to build a future. As Sarah looked out the window once again, Michael asked a question that had been on his mind for a while. "Sarah, do you ever regret leaving?" he asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned her head to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "I regret not telling you why I left," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I don't regret leaving. I needed to figure out who I was without anyone else's expectations. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to me either. But if I hadn't left, I don't think I'd ever have figured that out." Michael processed her words, realizing that she was right. In some ways, they had both needed time apart to grow. They were different people now, wiser perhaps, but also more uncertain of where life would take them. The journey they had been on had changed them in ways they couldn't have predicted. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but curious. "What do we do next?" Michael smiled, a slow and genuine smile. "We take it one step at a time," he said. "We don't have to figure everything out at once. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. And I don't think you are either." She laughed quietly, the sound a soft, almost hesitant thing. "You really think we can just pick up where we left off?" Michael shook his head. "No, we're not the same people we were before. We're different now, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can build something better, something that's ours." For the first time since the accident, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a possibility, and sometimes that was all they needed. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Sarah was discharged from the hospital, and though she still had some physical therapy ahead, she was stronger and more determined than ever. She and Michael began to rebuild their lives together step by step. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the past seemed like it would pull them back into old patterns. But they kept talking, kept learning about each other all over again. They went on long walks through the park, the same park where they had spent so many hours as teenagers. They visited old places, shared new experiences, and slowly but surely, their connection deepened once more. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Michael turned to Sarah and asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met again? If I hadn't been there that night?" Sarah thought about it for a moment. "I don't know. But I'm glad you were there," she said, her voice soft. "I think we were meant to find each other again. Maybe we didn't have to go through all of that, but it brought us back to each other." Michael smiled. "I think so too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, Michael and Sarah sat in comfortable silence, knowing that the road ahead would still be challenging. But for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could face it together.